Aurobindo and India's independence. I'd like to start with a prayer. Please join me in aspiration and prayer and listen from your heart and soul. This is a prayer by the Mother, May 22nd, 1914. When we have discerned successively what is real from what is unreal in all the states of being and all the worlds of life, when we have arrived at the perfect and integral certitude of the soul reality, we must turn our gaze from the heights of the Supreme Consciousness towards the individual aggregate which serves as the immediate instrument for thy manifestation upon earth, and see in it nothing but thee, our sole real existence. Thus each atom of this aggregate will be awakened to receive thy sublime influence. The ignorance and the darkness will disappear not only from the central consciousness of the being, but also from its most external mode of expression. It is only by the fulfillment, by the perfection of this labor of transfiguration, that there can be manifested the plenitude of thy presence, thy light, and thy love. Lord, thou makest me understand this truth ever more clearly. Lead me step by step on that path. My whole being, down to its smallest atom, aspires for the perfect knowledge of thy presence and a complete union with it. Let every obstacle disappear. Let thy divine knowledge replace in every part the darkness of the ignorance. Even as thou hast illumined the central consciousness, the will in the being, enlighten too the outermost substance, and let the whole individuality, from its first origin and essence to its last projection and most material body, be unified in a perfect realization and a complete manifestation of thy soul reality. Nothing is in the universe but thy love, thy light, thy life. Let everything become resplendent and transfigured by the knowledge of thy truth. Thy divine love floods my being. Thy supreme light is shining in every cell. All exults because it knows thee and because it is one with thee. The subject of my talk this morning is the golden jewels of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. I have, from my own experience, meditation and aspiration, culled out 4 golden jewels which combine to make Sri Aurobindo's yoga unique life-changing, world-transforming, and integral. In a way, these four golden jewels could be likened to the crown jewels, with precious stones and gems embedded in that. And actually, while gleaning these out, I felt very much that each, though separate, were interlinked and overlapped and brought forward something that is truly new and truly worth delving into. So let me begin. The four jewels, the golden jewels of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, could be summed up as the first, integrality; the second, change of consciousness and change of nature. So change of consciousness and nature. The third, psychicization, or what leads to divinization. And the fourth, the opening and unreserved surrender to the Mother. Let us take up the first. Sri Aurobindo's yoga is unique because of its meaning and scope. The meaning and scope of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, as he calls it himself, is integral, and therefore the integral yoga. And why he calls it integral is because he mentions that it covers all parts of the being. The yoga encompasses the mental, the vital, the physical, the subconscious and the inconscient, and its purification and transformation. Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the scope of his yoga, covers all planes of consciousness. It goes from the individual to the collective, to the cosmic, to the transcendent. It embodies the principle of Prakriti and Purusha, of Shiva and Shakti. It synthesizes all the yogas and yet brings to them an element that was hitherto lost or not brought forward, and that brings a new element of the supermind. It encompasses Tantra and Vedanta, and yet goes beyond them. And the yogic method of Sri Aurobindo is something quite unique. It not only goes towards the ascent of consciousness, but rather focuses more greatly and deeply on the descent of consciousness. Sri Aurobindo himself says that up until his yoga, the ascent of consciousness was far more emphasized in the yogas of the past, in all the other yogas. But though there is an ascent in his yoga too, it is to bring down the descent of consciousness. And why is that? Because the central mantra of his yoga and the integrality of his yoga is encompassed in this one line of his: all life is yoga. And if all life and all matter has to change and transform, then the descent of the Supreme Consciousness into matter, into life, into mind, into body, into the subconscious, into the inconscient, is the most important and paramount step that has to be taken. And therefore his yoga, as he says, my yoga begins where other yogas end. And he says that because the ascension and realization of the self, is the first part of his yoga. But it is only because it is there to bring down the supramental or the higher consciousness, even before the supramental, to bring down the descent of the mother's consciousness, that his yoga has been formulated. And that is why integrality is the core of his yoga. Its method and its scope is integral. Integral in all dimensions, covering all aspects. It is not an individual yoga only. It is a yoga that is collective, that is cosmic. His yoga was brought into manifestation by him to change the world, not just to change oneself, to transform the world, not just to transform oneself, not just to be able to achieve nirvana and mukti and bhukti, but to make this earth divine, to make matter divine, to bring a new species, as he says, a new race into existence, a new yoga. And that is why his yoga is integral and absolutely all encompasses. There is nothing that is not his yoga, in fact, and that is not included in his yogic circumference. And now let us come to the second golden jewel of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, and that is the change of consciousness and nature. Sri Aurobindo's yoga stresses on the paramount importance of changing human nature. And the central key or agency that Sri Aurobindo puts forward to change human nature, to change individual nature, is the psychic. It is through the agency of the psychic that human nature can transform, can get purified. And Sri Aurobindo's aim was to change the animal man into the divine man. And there were many ways, some of which I would like to mention because they are so central to his yoga, that he and Mother had formulated for this change of nature. So there were two steps in the change of nature. First is the growth of consciousness. The growth of consciousness comes with developing the individuality and then merging the individuality into the divine. So developing the sense, the highest powers of the mind, the body, the perfection of each, and then giving up the ego, dissolving the ego and surrendering it. And the main method that Sri Aurobindo put forward for this change of consciousness has been well brought out in his book, The Mother. It is through the agency, the personal effort that the individual puts forward, and through the agency and through aspiration, rejection and surrender. These I would call the gems in Sri Aurobindo's yoga that bring this ability of transforming human nature possible. Human nature was likened to the tail of a dog that would never change. Then what has Sri Aurobindo brought into manifestation, into his yoga, that can change human nature? Well, here are the three tools, the three methods he gives. And I'd like to read just a bit from them because they are so important. The personal effort that is required is a triple labor of aspiration, rejection and surrender. an aspiration vigilant, constant, unceasing, the mind's will, the heart seeking, the ascent of the vital being, the will to open and make plastic the physical consciousness and nature. Rejection of the movements of the lower nature. Rejection of the mind's ideas, our opinions, preferences, our habits, constructions. Rejection of the movements of the vital natures, desires, demands, cravings, sensations, lust, greed, jealousy, envy, hostility to the truth. Rejection of the physical natures, stupidity, doubt, disbelief, obscurity, obstinacy, laziness, pettiness, unwillingness to change, tamas, so that the true stability of light, power and ananda may establish itself in a body growing always more divine. Surrender, surrender of oneself and all one is and has, and every power and every plane of consciousness and every moment to the divine and the Shakti. It's very important here. Surrender is the key method, the most important method of this yoga. Without surrender, there is no yoga. And it's so important that this surrender has to be to the divine at every moment if one wants to transform one's nature, if one wants to change one's nature. Surrender of oneself and all one is and has, and every plane of consciousness and every moment to the divine and the Shakti. In proportion as the surrender, self-consecration progress, the sadhaka becomes conscious of the divine Shakti, doing the sadhana, but it cannot completely replace the necessity of personal effort. The second powerful method that the Mother has told us about is mantric jewel, remember and offer. If one wants to change one's nature, if one wants to change one's consciousness, if one wants to do Sri Aurobindo's yoga, one must remember him, remember the Mother, and offer as often as one can, daily, every moment. Remember and offer, remember and offer. Before one begins one work, before one begins to speak, in fact, one's breath itself should become a remembrance. And then something transforms in one's being. The next method that Sri Aurobindo enunciates is, he says, it's very simply, when all the sadhaks used to write letters to him, with one problem after the other, difficulties they were facing in their own nature, he would simply say one thing: call the Mother. Whenever you are in difficulty, whenever you don't know what to do, whenever you don't know how to act, what decision to take, call the Mother. Whenever you are in difficulty, whenever you have found something that you want to celebrate, call the Mother in your successes and your failures. And the next mantra, the change of consciousness, which the Mother enunciates is to live only for the divine, to make that the aim of your life, to make the aim of your life to live only for the divine. And if one can make that as the central aim of one's life, then the Mother's Shakti can descend into this human nature and transform it and create what she calls the being of gold. And that is why I've named this talk the Golden Jewels of Sri Aurobindo. Because that is his aim, to create this being of gold in us individually and in the collective body of humanity. And how does one do all this? Many people have written to the mother and asked, "But mother, I remember you and I'm full of devotion and bhakti towards you. But when I get back into the ordinary life, when I face the challenges of ordinary life, when people say things that are unjust or do things that are wrong, I lose my cool, I lose my equanimity. I'm unable to remember you. I get caught up, whether it is in my desires or in my anger or revolt. How do I always remember you? How do I always call you? How can I live only for you?" And the mother then, in Sri Aurobindo, in scores of letters, in the letters of yoga, have said one thing: bring the psychic forward. Open the psychic. It is through the inner conversion and awakening and coming forward of the psychic being that you will always be in contact with me. And how does one bring forward the psychic? Through meditation, through aspiration, through rejection, through surrender. So it comes back to the same methods. Remember and offer. But it is because these help the psychic being to come forward that these methods are given by Sri Aurobindo, that these ways are told by him, given to sadhaks. Do this and the psychic will come forward. And what does change of consciousness really mean? What is this change of human nature that Sri Aurobindo constantly talks about, and the mother then makes it into the pillar of the ashram yoga and the yoga of the world? What is this psychicization? Psychicization means, or the coming forward and the realization of the psychic, means the change of the lower nature, the entire nature. Psychicization, as Sri Aurobindo writes, means the change of the lower nature, bringing right vision into the mind, right impulse and feeling into the vital, right movement and habits into the physical, and finally the vision and sense of the mother everywhere, in all, as well as in the heart. It brings faith, it brings consecration and surrender. And the next golden jewel of Sri Aurobindo's yoga that I'd like to dwell on is divinization. If you see the gradation and the movement of his yoga, it begins with integrality in its meaning and scope. Integrality then encompasses all the planes and parts of the being. Every method of the yoga, Shakti, Purusha, ascent, descent, all, everything. And then it goes forward to the next movement of how does one change and transform the material human consciousness, our individual human nature. And it proceeds on to the change of consciousness. The growth of consciousness and then the change of consciousness. And the change of consciousness, the transformation of not only of the mental, vital, physical consciousness, but also the bringing forward and the realization of the psychic as its principal method. Why does it stress on the change of consciousness? Why does Sri Aurobindo stress on the change of consciousness? This is a very important question. Why? For a purpose. And that purpose brings us to the third jewel. Because if one wants to divinize oneself, if one wants to divinize and create a new race, a new species, a new world, then it can only be done through the change of consciousness. So that proceeds logically from growth and change of consciousness to divinization as the final aim of his yoga. Now this aim of his yoga, which is divinization, is quite different and quite new. Divinization as a central aim and principle has been there in the older yogas and in the past. However, divinization, not individually, but for a collective good and for the progress of humanity and the world, is something quite extraordinary and transforming. And this is the divinization that Sri Aurobindo sought. And this brings us to the third golden rule of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. And how does he propose that the divinization of human nature take place? There are 3 or 4 central methods and central mantras that he gives for this. In his letters on yoga, Sri Aurobindo talks about the triple transformation, where the individual begins with purification and transformation of the psychic being, of coming forward of the psychic, the purification and transformation of the mental being, of the vital being, of the physical being, leading to 3 separate stages in his yoga. These 3 separate stages in Sri Aurobindo's yoga are called by him the triple transformation. And these 3 stages lead us to divinization. If one wants to divinize oneself, these are the 3 stages one needs to go through. The first stage is the psychic transformation. The second stage is the spiritual transformation. And the third stage is the supramental transformation. I won't go into this, you can all read that. However, how does one do it? That is something that we always ask. How does one practice this? And that is more important. And I'd like to dwell on that. The mother had suggested and said very clearly, and I'd like to read that. And some of you may have read the 4 austerities and the 4 liberations. This was a very practical way opened by the mother for the transformation of the nature and the divinization of the nature. These are the 4 austerities. The tapasya of beauty. So it begins with the tapasya of beauty. So as if you want to transform and divinize your consciousness, begin with building nerves of steel. Have a great regularity in sleep, food, exercise, and every activity. No exceptions, indulge just for once. No more nightly escapades, no more feasting, no more distractions, amusements and pleasures that waste energy and leave one without the strength to do the daily practice. Austerity of a sensible and regular life, building a body that comes as close to perfection as possible. So the first austerity the mother mentions is the austerity and the tapasya of the physical consciousness, the body. What she calls the tapasya of beauty. What a beautiful name, the tapasya of beauty. Beauty in the body, beauty in the physical consciousness. And then she very practically gives you steps. Nobody can say, oh, this is too high and far flung. We cannot practice this. We cannot change our nature. We don't know how to bring the psychic forward. We don't know how to meditate. She's not asking you to do that. She's simply telling you clear principles that you can practice. But you must have great discipline and incredible aspiration to do it. But if one wants to do this, one can do it. It is so clearly written. Step by step by step. She will go from tapasya of beauty to tapasya of power, the vital nature, how to convert the vital nature's ambitions, desires, sensations, feelings. Then she will go to the tapasya of the mind, the tapasya of knowledge, and that is incredible. If you read the tapasya of knowledge, it can change your life, even if you have to practice just this one. Any one of them will change and transform your life. I would highly recommend those who aspire to do Sri Aurobindo's yoga to read the four austerities every day and try and practice just one thing. And then, in the end, she comes to the tapasya of love. And it's interesting, she distinguishes the tapasya of love from the tapasya of power. Both are aspects of the vital, and yet she distinguishes them. And what does she put into the tapasya of love? Of all the austerities, the mother says, the most difficult is the austerity of feelings and emotions, the tapasya of love. Only a greater, higher, and truer power of love can subdue the uncontrollable impulses of love. Only love can rule over love by enlightening, transforming, and exalting it. Of all the forces at work in the universe, love is the most powerful, she says, the most irresistible. And then she goes on from this high plane of the power and force of love to how does it manifest in our life? How do we do this tapasya? What does it mean for our relationships with others? And she says, relations with others should be one of total, unvarying, constant, and egoless kindness and goodwill that will not expect any reward or gratitude or even recognition. So here is the tapasya we have to practice in all our relationships, irrespective of what and how and when. Constant and egoless kindness and goodwill, no reward or gratitude or recognition. However others may treat you, you will never allow yourself to be carried away by resentment, and you will leave the divine, the sole judge, as to how he is to protect you and defend you against the misunderstanding and bad will of others. You can see, even while listening to these few snippets here and there, how powerful this is. And this is the way towards divinization. The mind of light was the one method that Sri Aurobindo has spoken a lot about, and the mother has spoken a lot about. I'd like to mention the mind of light to you because it is there in the tapasya of knowledge that the mother writes about and asks. And for divinization, the central agency, like we said, for change of consciousness, the central agency is the psychic, the coming forward, the opening of the psychic nature, and then the psychic influencing all the parts of our being, and the transformation and realization of the psychic. In the same way, for Sri Aurobindo's jewel of divinization, the agency and the method is the descent of the mind of light. It is through the mind of light and its first descent that the supramental consciousness can come down. Now you will tell me this is all very well, but it's too high, too philosophical. What do you mean by mind of light? And how do I open myself to this mind of light, to this higher light, this Gnostic consciousness that can bring about the divinization of the consciousness first, and then the divinization of the body? And here you have to go back again to the tapasya of knowledge on the 4 austerities of the mother. She has written there something that is transforming, which in fact I had not paid enough attention to. And it suddenly opened up for me when I was looking through and aspiring for this talk. And I'd like to read this out, because Sri Aurobindo has written a lot in the Life Divine, chapters and chapters on this subject. There's a whole book by Sri Aurobindo called The Mind of Light. But the way Mother has explained it so simply and practically, anybody can follow it. What the Mother speaks about is that when one begins to practice the tapasya of knowledge, which involves basically the ability to control one's thought, the ability to speak only what is essential and necessary, not to speak or say anything that does not help in the progress of the whole. When one begins to establish control over the mind and can speak and act from a quiet and silent mind, then through these practices of the mental austerity, which she divides into 4 parts, which is the social part, where you have to speak to others, which is relating to work or to relationships. It is the work part, where it is just about what work has to be done. Then she says there is the intellectual aspect of the austerity of knowledge, where one is speaking even of things, of knowledge, of wisdom, in every domain of the mind. If one begins to only say what is indispensable and speak only what is constructive, progressive, and can bring harmony and help towards the progress of any situation, of any work, of any relationship, then over time that will allow the mother's power and force to enter into the mind and create an opening for the mind of light, which is an intermediary power between the supramental and mental consciousness. It's like a delegate of the supermind. And this delegate of the supermind then, through this complete purification of the mental consciousness, which is practiced through words and how to use words and how to speak and what to say and what not to say, through that aspect of speech and thought, this mind of light, the consciousness of that begins to descend into the mind through the agency of the mother. And it is this that she says will create the passageway for the higher consciousness to descend into the mind, transform it, descend into the vital, transform it, and so on. So that is how, through the tapasya of knowledge, one can bring about an opening in the mental consciousness. Something that otherwise, when you read Sri Aurobindo, at least I couldn't find the method of how to do that. We can understand the principle of it, but the practical method, what do I do every day so that I may prepare my consciousness, prepare my mind to receive this higher intuitive, higher Gnostic consciousness, that I can bring my mind to a silent capacity. How do I do that? That is given in the 4 austerities. And then we come to the last aspect, the last golden jewel of Sri Aurobindo's yoga. And that is the opening to the mother, the divine Shakti. the opening to the Mother, her supreme grace, her supreme action in us. Now it's interesting. The opening to the Mother is there in all change of consciousness and divinization, in the Shakti and Purusha, in the integrality of yoga. But why separate it as a golden jewel? In fact, if I had to make a crown, I'd put the tiara as the Mother on top. Because in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the central method of his yoga is surrender to the Mother. The central process of his yoga is a surrender to the Mother. And he says clearly that the Mother stands between the highest supramental planes and the earth. And she is the executrix, the mediatrix through which the yoga unfolds. And that is why the opening to the Mother, always to remain open to her, is the one central secret of this yoga. As you may recall, one can have a brilliant mind, one can have great bhakti for Sri Aurobindo. Even Sri Aurobindo has said that in one of his letters to Dilip Kumar Roy, and some of you may have read them, that unless you open to the Divine Mother, to the Mother's force, my yoga cannot be purna. This yoga cannot be done. You can have great bhakti for me, but you must be open to the Mother, because she is the force of this yoga. She is the one who will open up your entire being. It is her Shakti and power. And surrender to her is the main mantra of this yoga. I'd like to end with these passages on this particular aspect. He says in the Mother, if you desire this transformation, put yourself in the hands of the Mother and her powers, without cavil or resistance, and let her do unhindered her work within you. These things you must have: consciousness, plasticity, and unreserved surrender. Then again, only when the four, Maheshwari, Mahalakshmi, Mahakali, and Mahasaraswati, have founded their harmony and freedom of movement in the transformed mind, life, body, can these other powers manifest in the earth movement and the supramental action become possible. Once again, it is only when these four powers of the Mother can freely move and establish themselves in the transformed mind, life and body can the supramental action be possible on earth, can divinization be possible. And finally, Sri Aurobindo says about the Divine Mother, but be on your guard and do not try to understand and judge the Divine Mother by your little earthly mind that loves to subject even the things that are beyond it to its own norms and standards, its narrow reasonings and erring impressions, its bottomless aggressive ignorance, and its petty self-confident knowledge. The human mind, shut in the prison of its half-lit obscurity, cannot follow the many-sided freedom of the steps of the Divine Shakti. The rapidity and complexity of her vision and action outrun its stumbling comprehension. The measures of her movement are not its measures. Bewildered by the swift alternation of her many different personalities, her making of rhythms and her breaking of rhythms, her accelerations of speed and her retardations, her varied ways of dealing with the problem of one and of another, her taking up and dropping now of this line and now of that, and her gathering of them together, it will not recognize the way of the supreme power when it is circling and sweeping upwards through the maze of the ignorance to a supernal light. Open rather your soul to her and be content to feel her with a psychic nature and see her with a psychic vision that alone make a straight response to the truth. Then the Mother herself will enlighten by their psychic elements your mind and heart and life and physical consciousness and reveal to them too her ways and her nature. So with that I conclude. If there are any questions you would like to ask. What is plasticity? The Mother defines plasticity, or Sri Aurobindo in his letters. Plasticity is when you are open and plastic to her touch. Like plastic, it bends, doesn't it? It can take a new shape, can it not? It's the same with your consciousness. The Mother wants you to be plastic to her, to be able to be bent and molded and remolded according to her way, not yours, not your mental way, not your mental preconceptions, not your mental ideas and habits, but hers, to be plastic to her touch, to be so passive and open that she can mold you in the way she wants.